Hey folks, Nathan here. One of the things you probably recognize about this channel, if you've looked at more than just a handful of videos, is that while most of it is relating to Star Wars in some way, I also play other games. And one of the things I like to do is to showcase the types of games I enjoy playing here on the channel, so it might spark some discussion about those games, find people of similar interest in those games who happen to be part of the audience for other videos and so forth, basically just sharing the love of the games themselves. This time we get a chance to talk about something that's pretty cool. You may recall that I backed the Kickstarter for Star Realms Frontiers, and we looked at all that stuff as it came in, and then looked at it as part of Nate's favorite deck building games. Well, this time we're taking a look at another Kickstarter game that will eventually come to retail. This is Nemesis from Awaken Realms. This is a game with an original goal of £50,000, it's all in British pounds, £50,000 that met that funding goal in 4 minutes. Their newest game, Tainted Grail, met their funding goal within 1 minute, and if I remember correctly, wound up being the top Kickstarter grossing game, possibly the top grossing Kickstarter in general of 2018. This is a team that has a fantastic record of really solid games and community involvement in the development of those games, particularly when it comes to things like expansions. Now, Nemesis is shipping in 2 different waves. A lot of people decided to go with one single wave of shipping to save money, but that means they're not getting their games until sometime in the summer of 2019. I opted for 2-wave shipping, which meant that the first wave with the core set and a few of the stretch goals and whatnot has already arrived, and the rest will be coming then. So what we're going to take a look at is the core box, the little goodies that came with it, and any stretch goals relating to it. What we're going to focus on is what are the contents of the box, the individual items within it, and what relates to stretch goals. We are not going to go through all the rules of how to play the game, though I will touch on that as we talk about the different components as we go through it. As we go through and mention the stretch goals, we'll also talk about what the funding level was to reach them, but again, that will be in British pounds because that was the local currency of this particular Kickstarter. Really kind of threw me for a loop as I'm used to thinking in terms of dollars, but shame on me, I'm an economics teacher, I should know better. So, what you see here is the box that it ships in. Notice the little S. There are 3 different ways you could basically get your Nemesis miniatures. You could get them either not painted at all, through a thing called Sundrop, which is a type of painting, sort of a batch painting that's sort of a shading that's done in color rather than individually detailed painted sections, and then you've got fully painted miniatures. The fully painted option was way out of my price range and meant that you wouldn't get your painted minis for quite a while. But I didn't want to go for just the regular plain minis either, so I opted for Sundrop, which is that interesting, cost-effective middle ground, hence the S in yellow here on the package. I believe that all those with unpainted minis have a gray sticker right there, and we haven't seen the painted minis yet because those won't be coming until closer to Wave 2. Before we open it, one interesting thing as they shipped it was that every corner had one of these plastic pieces on it to keep it from being damaged. Yeah, only one of mine survived the trip, and I've heard of people getting their boxes where none of those survived the trip. But thankfully, not many boxes showing up damaged, thanks to these being on there from the start. Now, when you first open up the box, you're going to find that before you even get to the core game, there's this little box of what they're calling Kickstarter bonus content. Understand this is not to be confused with stretch goals. One of the things that Awaken Realms likes to do is, if it's cost feasible, they will add little gifts along the way into the boxes sent out to the Kickstarter backers. A lot of times they're tied into their other games, sort of promo items and such, but generally there will tend to be at least something tied into the game that you just bought. That's what this box is. And interestingly, this one actually does have something in it that's sort of a freebie bonus, but also tied into a couple of stretch goals as we'll look at here. So first we're going to remove this, get rid of the styrofoam, and then we'll have our Kickstarter bonus content box. So here's our bonus content box. Got Space Cat on there. When they hit 20,000 backers, one of the things they did was provide a free Space Cat miniature that could be used basically as a first player marker, or first player token, essentially, using that special mini in place of a token that's in the base game. Kickstarter backers actually voted for which of 2 different models to use, and eventually they took all 4 possible models of Space Cats, made them available in a larger size after the fact through GameFound for those who were backing if they wanted to do it as an add-on outside of the campaign. So there's your Space Cat. Okay. On the back, just a quick advertisement for Tainted Grail, their next Kickstarter, their next big Kickstarter. You find a few things in here. One here is the Etherfields playing card deck. This is a game that will eventually be made by Awaken Realms. Etherfield's Name of Mare, apparently a cooperative story-driven board game with a focus on character development, etc., as it says. But what this is, essentially, is just a deck of playing cards. But they're really sweet-looking playing cards. You got the different models and different backgrounds and whatnot. You flip it over. You got really nice designs and artwork highlighted for the individual cards. So just a standard playing card deck here with some art versus mini cards as well. For those who are wondering why are some of the cards there with a different back, wouldn't that be like marked cards? No, they're just art cards. You take them out before you use the regular deck. Then you got a little envelope inside of which is a coin for Tainted Grail. It's a metal coin that's used as a counter. See, it's got the numbers going around there so you could spin it to represent, you know, a counter, spin it, and have a certain direction representing whatever number comes up to use it kind of like a die. You could flip it because it does have sort of a heads and tails, but nice little coin added. This is one of those things that you can actually add to Tainted Grail. As one of their add-ons, you could go through and basically take the plastic ones, the regular ones that are inside the regular game, and you could upgrade them to metal ones if you like. Also in there is a letter from the CEO of Awaken Realms, along with some information about, hey, you know, if any of your minis are bent or damaged or whatever, or if you're missing something, here's how to reach out about it. Here's how to fix the mini yourself if it happens to, you know, need to be bent or something like that. Kind of standard stuff. Also related to Tainted Grail, we have a Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon art book. Now, this is all art and some information about the game, some text and story elements and stuff telling you about that Kickstarter that was coming, but it's all based on the prototype of Tainted Grail, not the actual finished version. So this is not the same art book you would get if you got the art book through the Tainted Grail Kickstarter campaign. And then here's the really cool one for fans of just Nemesis. This is Nemesis Untold Stories #1. This is basically a comic book slash game book for co-op play. There is one coming later that'll also be a solo campaign. But essentially, it's kind of a combination of choose your own adventure meets gameplay. So you've got the comic, very dark-looking stuff there, like a lot of the Alien comics, which makes sense because Nemesis really kind of borrows heavily from the Alien franchise, at least for its core game. But then you get into the campaign itself, and it'll have you set up with specific new rules for these campaign missions. But you'll start off by reading a comic section, and as you make decisions, you'll jump to different encounters and so forth. It'll give you a mission. Based on the results of that mission, you'll then go to a certain page or a certain event, a certain result, a certain ending, etc., etc. And basically you play through 4 different missions with a lot of different permutations to get different endings and different paths through this cooperative campaign. Now, what's really interesting to me for this is that this was actually kind of a controversial thing in the base game. Basically what happened was they hit upon this idea of doing something like this and decided to make it part of their stretch goals. And the idea was that you would unlock 10 pages at a time as the stretch goals progressed. The first 10 pages were unlocked at 1,650,000 pounds, and the next 10 pages at 1,700,000 pounds. Except the very idea kind of pissed off some people who expected to just be getting a standard board game and didn't want anything even remotely like this in the mix. So instead, they said, okay, we're just going to cut it off here at the 20 pages. That'll be the stretch goal, but we'll do a separate one for those who actually want it, who can get it as an add-on. So 20 pages, and then something completely different that was going to be about 80 pages. Well, they decided, you know what? We're going to take that original one that was only supposed to be 20 pages, we're going to make it 80 pages also, and give it to everyone. as sort of a beefed up version of that stretch goal. So everybody gets Untold Stories #1, the co-op campaign comic, but then if you look in the back, they let you know what's coming soon. Untold Stories #2, that's the add-on, which is a Nemesis single-player campaign comic. So pretty cool that they took some stretch goals that were very controversial and kind of annoyed some people but excited others, and gave us a way to still have it be really awesome, and at the same time, still was able to sort of appease those who really did not like the idea. They could use it or not, it's not necessary for gameplay, it's just another way to play. And interestingly, this is sort of a scenario here that is a little bit different than the base game, at least in terms of the story itself, but it gives you a use for an alternate ship layout from the other side of the game board, which we'll talk about later, and fills in some story gaps, letting you know who these aliens actually are, where are they from, what's the deal with them, that at this point, outside of this, have only been hinted at in little prose story-type snippets that we get on the Kickstarter campaign page for the game. So for someone like me who loves to know the backstory of a game and the villains involved, this is absolutely awesome. I should note also that that actually needs some extra tokens beyond the base game, so you do have a separate punch board here of different tokens just for working with Untold Stories #1. We're going to take a look at those tokens as well, but we'll do that as we get into the base game so I can show you where I happen to have stored them. Once we're past that box of extra goodies, that's when we see the actual game box packed in here very nicely and with a little piece of foam to protect it from shifting back and forth as it's shipping. But here is the actual game box. We got an Intruder, we've got the Soldier, game by Adam Kwapinski, Awaken Realms, Rebel, and then here's the back, which describes it for us. It says, Nemesis is a 1 to 5 player space survival game with incredible miniatures and clever, immersive rules that include cooperation, bluffing, backstabbing, and all other elements of an iconic science fiction horror adventure. The crew wakes up from hibernation. The damage report states there's a critical system failure and the ship can't continue its cruise. The task is to find the damage, repair it, and safely return to Earth. The problem: one crew member is dead. Somebody ripped open his hibernation pod and pulled his body out. To make matters worse, you can hear noises in the vast corridors of the ship. They sound unlike anything you've heard before. When faced with the ultimate horror, will you trust your crewmates? It points out the components: 26 high-quality miniatures, originally meant to be 25, but a stretch goal added 1, 300 plus cards, 20 cardboard room tiles, originally meant to be 19, 200 other components, 2-sided cardboard map, originally meant to be 1-sided, and plastic insert, a way to actually keep everything inside the box. Then you got some early reviewers. It knows it is for 14 plus, and there's a warning relating to that as well. Game should last about 1 hour to 2 hours, and is a 1 to 5 player game. Yes, you can play it solo. You can play it semi-cooperative, where the backstabbing can happen. You can play it as fully cooperative, but also you can play with up to 5 players in either full cooperative or semi-cooperative mode. However, there are 6 characters available in the base game, and eventually there'll be about 12 of them. So you might say, well, wait a second, why 1 through 5? It's a game balance thing. Though from a story standpoint, the rationale is up here in that description, right? That one of your crewmates is already dead when you start, so even if you're playing with the maximum number of characters, one of you is supposed to be the dead body that you'll find in the starting room. And of course, Awaken Realms, Rebel, the copyright date of 2018, though for many people it was arriving in early 2019, and so on. Each side then has one of the characters with Nemesis, here in this case, the Scout. Now bear in mind, along with the stuff you're going to see here, there are 7 punch boards for all the tokens and whatnot that you're going to need for the game itself. Again, I've already punched them, so I'm not looking at them going, ooh, I wonder what that is, so I can show you what they're all about when we get into the box. Here we have one of the nifty little bonuses that they provided for those who backed the game, and that is basically a box stand. Right, so if you want to show off the box, although it's kind of heavy, so you might want to do it when it's empty, then here's your little Nemesis stand. That was not something that was ever previously announced to be available. You have your game manual, nice and big here. I've heard a lot of complaints about the manual. One, because we had some folks who took part in proofing it early on when they made an early copy available to the whole Kickstarter community. Yes, there were some language errors, there were some typos. The original people making the game are mostly from Poland, but the vast majority of that has been dealt with for the final version. It is a much nicer layout. This is a game with a lot of different rules and permutations for situations, but to me, it's not a very confusing read. I know some people say that it is, and certainly we'll be needing a frequently asked questions, which they say is coming very soon. But I think for what it does, and as concise as they're able to make it here with all the different things going on, the rules, once you read it once or twice, you'll be in pretty good shape with it. We have our game board, which we'll take a look at momentarily. We then have two so-called room sheets. Okay? The game takes place in rooms that are modular. They randomize their locations as you play. In fact, some of the possible rooms don't even show up in every game. And in order to know what each room's room action is, something you can do in the room if you pay an action cost, they give you a couple of these sheets that let you have a look at the different abilities and how they play out rule-wise, instead of placing all of that rule text in the actual tokens that would make it look kind of ugly when you're actually playing it as a game board. All this information, though, plus a little bit more, is found in the rulebook. These are just kind of cheat sheets. This is the fore section of the ship. I'll scoot it back so we can see the aft section momentarily, but you've got a marker here letting you know that this is the regular game version of the map. There's a more advanced version on the back that's also used as the ship known as the Ariadne when you're playing that Untold Stories comic-based co-op campaign. But this is the Nemesis. Our technical corridor spot is here, so anytime an intruder is within the technical corridors or the technical corridors could affect a situation, you got these little markers with little red dots on all these different rooms that are all connected to the technical corridors. This is our representation of what's in those corridors. Is there a noise marker or not? Has an intruder gone there and disappeared or not? We have our cockpit here. Basically, when you wake up from hypersleep, essentially you have only limited knowledge of your objectives, some certain basic functions, a thing in your head that keeps you from directly killing your fellow crew members. So if your objective is to kill one of them, you have to do it in kind of a sly way by setting them up, or just winding up with them being killed in some other way not related to you. And the cockpit here is one of three things that you actually know the location of. You know the cockpit, the hibernatorium where you woke up, and the engines. Every other room is going to be randomized, as we'll see. But in the cockpit, you have 4 slots, A, B, C, D, that let you know what destination it's heading for. And it starts out with a marker on B. Well, what A, B, C, or D means, like which one is Earth, which one is Mars, etc., that's going to be determined by a coordinate card that's randomly determined at the beginning of the game and placed here face down. You can come up here and check the coordinates. You can come up here and set new coordinates. All your different rooms are connected by corridors, and they all have a number. Anytime something refers to the highest, lowest, or whatever numbered room, you check the little number beside it. 1 here, 4 here, very hard to see. You got your corridors that connect the rooms. The corridors always have numbers. Even the technical corridors have numbers where you got your little marker there saying, hey, you know, this is a technical corridor connected to that and connected to all these other ones. When you roll for noise, as we'll see, or you're talking about a corridor identification, it's based on the number. So if I am told to put a noise marker in the corridor marked 4, when I'm in the cockpit, I put it in this corridor here because it's marked with the 4. We have these room tiles that we're going to wind up placing down, face down, in all these different marked spaces to represent rooms that we know are aboard the ship in some cases, but don't necessarily know which room is which until we actually explore and go into them. All of the ones that we're going to find marked as 1, the basic rooms are in play at all times, and then in a typical game, you're also going to find that only some of the additional rooms, the ones marked as 2, actually show up in the game. So you're going to place your tiles face down on all these different spots, all these different hexagonal spots. They all have a little marker to let you know by turning the face up side of that room how many items are in them. We'll see that when we look at the room tiles. And you're also going to place an exploration token on each one that'll tell you something about what happens when you go into that room, along with how many items are in there that you could search for. But all these hexagonal spots, that's all going to be where you're going to put your rooms that are all connected through the different corridors that they themselves are numbered. The hibernatorium, that's where you go into hypersleep. And then, down in the corner, if you have activated the self-destruct, this is where that will count down. It starts at 6, makes its way down to the skull, which is, hey, guess what? The whole thing just blew up. When you hit the midpoint and you cross into that orange zone, that symbol there means that the escape pods have all just automatically unlocked. Can't get into them until they're unlocked, and this is one of the ways to do that. Then this here is our aft section. This is where your 3 engines can be found, each of which is going to have a stack of 2 tokens on top of it, the top one of which will determine whether the engine is working or damaged. You're going to need to make sure at least 2 of them are working in order to escape into hyperspace. Otherwise, the ship blows up from 2 damaged or more damaged engines. Down here at the bottom, this is our time track. It starts at 15. With every turn, it goes down by 1. Eventually, as it crosses from 9 to 8, the hibernation chamber opens, so you can actually get into a hibernation pod, and eventually it hits that symbol down here at the end, which is essentially 0, which is when the ship jumps to hyperspace through sort of an emergency protocol, and if you're not in a hibernation pod at that point, you are toast, or actually splatter. This is the reverse side, which you can either think of as a more advanced version of the Nemesis, or you can think of as the Ariadne. One interesting thing about what makes this a little more difficult is that sometimes you want to keep one room separated from another through a closed door, but some of these rooms are connected to other rooms by 2 at a time instead of just 1 at a time. One benefit, at least, is that you do know where the rooms are that control the escape pods from the start on this map because they're placed face up here and here. Otherwise, it basically plays the same. It's just a tougher map to deal with. One thing you'll also find is that the ship layout is a little bit different in terms of basic versus additional rooms. On the regular Nemesis side, all the basic rooms are around the outer hull of the ship, and you have to go towards the interior to get to the additional rooms. Well, in this case, all the ones from the number 2, the additional rooms pile of tokens, are up towards the fore part of the ship, and all of the basic rooms are toward the aft part of the ship. I would note, by the way, that this map is pretty large. In order for us to have enough room to play, we've actually had to put 2 card tables next to each other, one for the map and a few things, and then one for all the tokens and cards and everything else. So you're going to need a fairly large play area to play this unless you want to keep all your tokens in the box as you play, which is kind of a pain in the butt. So now we get to the cool stuff, all the different game components and whatnot. You've got 2 different trays, 2 different inserts designed to hold everything just right. Those sleeved cards, even with the Paladin cards that this company made available, seems to be a hit or miss thing. It seems like there might have been a couple of different moldings of the actual trays. Some people have sleeved their cards and it worked great. Some have sleeved their cards and it won't fit. Personally, I don't tend to sleeve my cards for games like this, so that's one thing I didn't pick up with this campaign. Can't show you the sleeved cards. The individual trays each have a plastic cover to keep things in, nice and tight, and the top one has several items here on top of it for us to look at first. This is our Intruder board. The Intruder board is going to keep track of how many eggs are in the Intruder or alien nest. It gives us a cheat sheet of the Intruder symbols we're going to see throughout the game for the different types of Intruders, the larva, creeper, adult, breeder, and queen that we'll see as minis here momentarily. And then as you play the game, you can discover weaknesses to the Intruders that make it a little bit easier to deal with them in combat situations. There are 3 ways to do that. You can analyze the corpse of a dead character, including the one you find at the very beginning of the game that I mentioned previously, or it could be the Intruder egg that you examine, or a dead Intruder's carcass. Any of those, when they are researched, allow you to take one of the 3 Intruder weakness cards in these slots down at the bottom and flip it face up to get that benefit in combat. But this will basically be the tracker for what you know and what needs to be known about the aliens. Then each of your player character possibilities has a player board. We have our soldier, themed in red, the scout, themed in purple, the captain, themed in dark blue, the scientist, themed in sort of a gray, the pilot, themed in green, and the mechanic, themed in orange. The mechanic, by the way, was a stretch goal character. The different bits and pieces that let us actually get the mechanic through the stretch goals were at the 75,000, 100,000, 125,000, and 150,000 pound levels. So some of the earliest stretch goals gave us access to this extra character to play as. As for what's on our character cards, aside from just an image of the character, we have an image of the mini, so we know for sure, which mini it is. That's also where we're going to put a larva miniature if someone winds up being attacked by one and it winds up infesting them. If they've been covered in slime, we put a marker here. If by chance they have managed to get to the comms room and send out a signal, which is one of the goals for some of the objectives, we can put a tab there. Then we have this wound track over here. The first time they get a light wound, it goes here. They get another light wound, it goes here. As a track, again, it moves from one to the next. It is a track, not one here, then one here. Some question about that originally. And then once you've accumulated 2 and you get another light wound, that is a serious wound. If you get 3 serious wounds and then get any more wounds, either light or serious, you die. And yes, it is basically just 3 light equals a serious. So if you're here and you get 2 more light wounds, you get a serious because it moved once, and then there's one that goes up here for 1 light wound that is left. They clarify that through some comments on Board Game Geek and elsewhere. There's information down here about crafting. You'll be able to craft some items, so they show you what symbols together give you different items, just kind of a cheat sheet there. You have some basic actions that cost you 1 action card to play. Movement, 2 different types of attack, either shooting or hand-to-hand, essentially. Picking up a heavy object, not a heavy item. There are heavy items and heavy objects in the game. Heavy objects are just the intruder's eggs, an intruder carcass, or a character's corpse. Basically the 3 things that you can take to go get analyzed for intruder weaknesses, as I showed you on that card. Then we've got trading and crafting items that are available. And if you want to spend 2 action, you can do careful movement. Essentially, regular movement has the potential of drawing noise, which could wind up eventually bringing one of the aliens upon you, and careful movement lets you basically choose which corridor attached to the room you just entered the noise affects, rather than it being randomized by the roll of a die. Now down here at the bottom, it does note left hand, right hand. You can only carry 2 heavy items or objects at a time, 1 in either hand. There is a wound card that knocks out your ability to have one of these if it's a serious wound. You have your action card deck sitting over off to this side. As you play it, the discarded cards go face up, and your discard pile up against this side. And those cards work a lot like a deck building game. As soon as it's time to draw one, if there's not one sitting there in your action cards deck, you pick up your discard, you shuffle it, that becomes your new deck, and you draw. So a lot of stuff being tracked here just with your basic character board. Underneath, we have a nice mixture here of various game-related items, whether it's minis, card holders, tokens, dice, you name it. This is your scanner or contamination scanner. We'll take a look at this a little bit later when we look at contamination cards. This was originally meant to be a little bit more flimsy, but the sheer funding level of the game managed to make it nice and thick. It tells you how to deal with infection here on the back. The game actually only ever uses 2 different types of dice, and you only typically roll 1 at a time. So it's not a very dice-heavy game, though the ones that you do have, you will use quite often. Okay? We have a D10 that is going to be our noise die. Basically, every time you move into a room through normal movement, you're going to wind up rolling this thing. And the numbers on it represent different numbers that are on the map for each corridor that's attached to the room that you're in, or the technical corridors, which is like a thing that runs throughout the ship, like the vents and whatnot. And whichever number comes up, you put a noise marker in that location. And the next time a noise marker gets put in that same location, that's when an alien's gonna pop out and attack you. Or excuse me, an intruder. Not xenomorphs from Alien at all, surely. This is gonna be your danger symbol here. Basically, this draws intruders to you. So if there's one nearby in an adjacent room, or a neighboring room as they call it, it'll come at you if you roll this. On the other hand, if there's multiple in neighboring rooms, guess what? They all come at you. Yeah, kind of sucks for you. And if none are nearby in neighboring rooms, it means a noise token gets put on every single corridor, so still it ups the likelihood of dealing with aliens in the near future. Then the X there, you're a lucky, lucky space cadet, because hey, that's silence, no noise goes down. We actually originally were only going to get 1 of these. Now we have 2, enough for 2 players to not have to constantly shift them back and forth, though you really only need 1 to play the game. It's nice to have a spare. We got that other one at the 575,000 pound stretch goal. You then also have your combat die. We have 2 of that one also, thanks to the 600,000 pound stretch goal. But basically, instead of it always being numbers, you have these symbols. If you're sharp-eyed, you recognize those are the same symbols that showed up on our Intruder board that gave us sort of the shorthand of what each one means in terms of what type of creature. Basically, depending on what you roll, it can affect certain levels of creatures in certain ways, and it's basically whatever that level is downward in terms of complexity. You also have a 1-shot or 2-shot sort of guaranteed hit thing, and basically they just change the rules a little bit as you go from a melee attack to something that is using an actual weapon, whether it's an energy weapon or a classic weapon that uses regular bullets. So sometimes you'll be rolling that 2 and actually getting 2 hits, but if you're basically just swinging a pipe at them or something instead of shooting them, it's still going to wind up only doing 1 damage. But at least it's definite damage on whatever type of intruder it is, rather than this one, for instance, this is for a creeper. This one's not going to do a thing if you wind up going after, say, a queen or a breeder or an adult with it. So not numbers, but symbols, and we do have one side that represents having missed entirely. Now the consequences for missing or for even attacking, when you're attacking by hand, tend to include getting contaminated by the aliens. You really want to make sure that you stand a little bit far away and blast them rather than trying to take them on hand to hand, but sometimes that's your only choice. You're going to have 8 of these little egg tokens. The game starts with 5 of them, basically sitting in the alien nest. There is an event card that can cause them to hatch on you, but you can also destroy them to destroy the nest. So they just sort of represent the number of them that are there at any given time. Certain circumstances, like certain things that can happen with your intruder bag, as we'll look at, can cause more eggs to show up in the nest, making it harder to wipe out the entire nest, etc. But you have 8 of these to denote the eggs being there. These, then, are those little noise tokens. You got kind of this symbol here of kind of like a doorway-looking thing with these waves coming out from it. These are noise tokens. Originally, they were meant to be cardboard. They wound up upgrading them to plastic without it actually ever being a stretch goal in this case. But these here are what you're going to put in corridors to note which ones have noise and are therefore more likely to bring the enemy. We then have 8 malfunction tokens, originally meant to be cardboard. They became plastic tokens at the 2,050,000 pound stretch goal. But basically, they just denote when you get a room where the room action, every room has an action you can do for usually the cost of 2. Basically, that room action isn't available until you repair the room if you got one of these tokens. There's 8 of those. You also have 8 plastic fire tokens to denote a room that's on fire, and that can hurt the player at the end of their round. That can hurt an intruder during a certain part of the event phase, the second big chunk of steps in any given turn. These were also meant to originally be cardboard. They became plastic at the 2 million pound stretch goal mark. And note, there's 8 of both of those. What happens if you have to place a 9th? Well, it's not just, well, use something to represent a fire or malfunction token because you're out of them. No, there's a reason there's only 8. If you have to ever place a 9th, then the ship gets destroyed. It either explodes because of all the fire, or it winds up basically having hull integrity cause the ship to explode thanks to too many malfunctions. There is also, by the way, an event card that causes a fire to spread to all adjoining rooms that don't have doors closed. So definitely got to be careful when that happens. My wife and I ran into that and almost wound up with the ship blowing up under our feet. We've got 18 of these little universal markers that are nice because when they sit on something, it magnifies what's underneath it. These are going to mark things like, did you send a signal? Or did you get slimed? It'll mark the destination on the destination track to let you know which destination the ship is on its way to. It'll be how you mark time in terms of the number of turns there are before the ship goes into hyperspace, whether you're in a hibernation pod or not. Because if you're not in a pod, you get splattered by the G-forces. But the intruders don't because of their hard carapace. This is also how you'll mark things like the self-destruct tracker and so forth. These were originally going to be different types of tokens, and one of the types, the slime token, was going to wind up being a token of its own, and got upgraded to plastic by a stretch goal. It was the 375,000 pound stretch goal. But eventually, when they decided to go to more of a universal marker instead of a slime one, the slime plastic stretch goal wound up basically going nowhere. So that's probably why they wound up with the noise tokens. That or ammo, which is another piece here. We have 50, originally we were going to be 40, now there's 50, of these little red cubes. These are what are used to track your ammo. These are what are used to track the damage that you do to the intruders and so forth. They thought it'd be easier to basically just move this from your gun to the intruder to denote that that shot damaged it for 1 or for whatever it was, in that case 1 injury. Originally, they, again, had another stretch goal at 400,000 pounds, which is going to make ammo tokens, these plastic custom tokens. They eventually decided to do away with separating out damage and ammo, so it became one sort of universal token type here. So they are plastic, but they're not any kind of custom look at all. The original game was meant to have these little plastic cubes in the first place. Then you have 12 door tokens. You have just the cardboard token and the little stand for it. They can be standing, which means a locked door. Fallen down, which means the door has been destroyed, so you can keep going through it, but no one can ever lock it again. Or if it's not on the map, it's just an open corridor with the door open. Then we got some small sort of nickel-sized tokens. At the 1,800,000 pound stretch goal, they added an extra room. That's why I said there are 20 rooms, but originally meant to be 19. The 20th is an airlock, and to go with it, you need a token to represent the airlock cycle happening. So the airlock procedure token is the one here with your exclamation point on it. You then have 5 tokens to represent dead members of the crew. The blue one here always starts in the hibernatorium, the hibernation pod room that you wake up in at the beginning of the game, representing one of the characters already having died, which also gives you a body you can immediately take to go research to try to get an intruder weakness. Then as other characters die, you put the red ones in. And because the game ends when everybody's dead and it's a maximum of 5-player game, you've got 4 of these and 1 of these. The dead one that's not a player, and then 4 for the players who die first, and then when the 5th player dies, you don't need 1 because the game is over. I should note, by the way, that there is a thing coming in Wave 2 of the game called the Terrain Expansion. What the Terrain Expansion does is basically it replaces your doors, your eggs, and your dead bodies with plastic tokens rather than cardboard ones. Purely cosmetic, adds nothing to the gameplay, but a nice little addition if you're someone who likes to have that kind of thing added to your game. Yes, I got it. Yes, we'll be looking at it in Wave 2. Circular tokens include also 2 that represent 5 injuries each for your intruders, because some of them are pretty powerful. They're going to need more. Then you've got 8 to represent intruder carcasses. When you kill the aliens, this represents their body left behind that you can take to go get analyzed. Now, throughout the game, one of your goals is going to be to survive and get back to Earth. And you could make sure that you're on the ship and that the ship gets to Earth. That's one way to do it. But you can also just hop in an escape pod and eject, because they assume that anyone who gets out in the escape pod will be found and taken back to Earth. There are 4 escape pods in the game represented by tokens, so you know when a slot actually has an escape pod in it. All of them have spaces for 2 characters, and they have a locked and unlocked side. You have to manually unlock them, or if the ship's self-destruct is active, once it gets about halfway through the countdown procedure, they all automatically unlock for you. To get into them, you'll have to go to a specific type of room, which we'll take a look at. If your plan is to get the ship itself back to Earth, or maybe cause it to explode, then you have to know the status of the engines. There are 3 engines on the ship, and 2 of them need to be in working order for the ship to make a hyperspace jump to go to Earth, or Mars in the case of one of the different objectives that you might happen to draw. Now, the way you do that is by checking the status on a couple of different tokens. They sit stacked with the engine number like this. The top one would denote what the actual status is, but if someone goes to check the engines and use the repair ability, they can switch the status. The thing about it is that only the person who checks it actually sees the status, and they can tell people what the status is, or they could lie through their teeth if it turns out that their objective better coincides with not telling the truth about that particular scenario. So we have 2 representing Engine 1 with working and damaged versions, a pair for Engine 2. Notice that they are a different shape, and a pair for Engine 3. The different shapes help you place them on the board to begin with. You also have a first player token. Notice there, it's that Space Cat again. That's why it made sense that when they did that Space Cat miniature that we'll get in Wave 2 as a thank you, as a stretch goal at 20,000 backers, that is the Space Cat that you'd pass between players. There's your first player token. The idea is that, yeah, when you're initially coming up with who's going to play and who's going to get to pick their characters first and stuff like that, there is a player order, but once you sit down, it just goes clockwise around the table. But in order to make it so the same person isn't always going first, this is going to pass throughout the game as part of the first phase of play each turn, so that who's the first player changes each different turn. It cycles. As you explore rooms on the ship, each room is not just going to have the room tile itself, but also these little question mark tokens called exploration tokens. When you flip over the room, you also flip over and resolve this token. The number at the top is going to tell you how many items that room has in it in case you want to search it, assuming that it's not the room covered in slime or the nest, which can't ever have items. In this case, this is the slime result. So your character gets covered in slime. Thankfully, there's only 2 of these out of the 20 exploration tokens. You then also have danger tokens, only 2 of those. Again, same result as what happens with the danger result on a noise roll, where it draws them to you or winds up putting noise in all the corridors that don't already have noise tokens attached to the room that you are in. Only 2 of those. There's one that actually sets the room on fire, and somehow I always run into this one fairly early in a game, but it is just one of that type, so fire won't happen as an exploration all that often. You have 2 that represent silence, just like the noise roll, where thankfully no noise got out. Bear in mind there is only 2 of those, and if you are covered in slime, then this result becomes a danger result. Same thing if you roll the noise roll and get silence if you're covered in slime. There are 4 exploration tokens that slam the door behind you, and bear in mind that a closed door takes some doing to get open. It's not just use a quick action and open it. You have to have a specific ability in play at the time. And then you have 8 that immediately place a malfunction token in the room you explored, which is going to wind up stopping you from using the room action until you repair that room. You then have 5 of these little item holders that have your initial player number on them. Basically, you sit them and they sort of tilt back, and only you can see the items that you have. These were unlocked at the 575,000 pound stretch goal. Then we have the so-called Intruder bag. As you play, certain tokens will be going in and out of this bag to represent how the infestation on the ship is growing and changing. This will also be what determines which type of alien jumps out at you if you wind up having an encounter from 2 different noise tokens hitting the same corridor. Also, the tokens in here have a reverse side. They're going to let you know whether a surprise attack happens. It's a pretty versatile little bag full of tokens and an interesting way of pulling off some randomness. You have a total of 27 of these tokens that go in the bag. You have 1 representing the queen with her symbol on it. You have 1 that's blank. You have 2 that represent the breeder type, similar to the queen type, but different symbol here. 12 to represent adults. 3 to represent creepers. And 8 to represent larvae. You could think of, if this game in a lot of ways is analogous to sort of the ship situation in the first Alien film, but with more creatures, so kind of more like Alien in that respect, but the ship is what the game is named after, kind of like Alien Covenant or Prometheus, etc., etc. There's all these different alien elements in this. You could sort of think of the larvae as kind of like the face huggers, and then your creepers kind of like the chest bursters. Then you got your adults that are like your main ones, the queen kind of like the queen, but there is a level between adult and queen in this game, which is the breeders. But we'll take a look at their minis here in a moment. Notice that each one of these tokens has a warning on the back. If this number back here is higher than the number of action cards in your hand, then congratulations, you've just been hit by a surprise attack. If not, then the creature shows up but doesn't surprise attack you. It's a nice mechanic. If you're curious exactly about how those work with the bag, basically at the end of the second phase of play, there's the player phase where every player plays 2 actions and then moves to the next player and then moves to the next player. And they keep going around and around 2 actions at a time until everybody has passed. Then it moves on to the event phase where several different things happen, the last of which is this bag's token set being developed. You draw a larva token, you wind up replacing it with an adult token. You draw a creeper token, you replace it with a breeder token. You draw an adult, everybody rolls for noise, you may have a bunch of encounters happen, and then this goes right back into the bag to be drawn again. Breeder, same thing that happened with the adult, and then this goes back in there. Pulling the queen either makes her show up in the nest if someone's actually already in the nest, or if nobody's in the nest or it hasn't been discovered yet, another egg gets added in the nest by putting another egg on the intruder board. That's one of the ways you're able to keep track of how many eggs are in the nest without actually knowing where the nest is beforehand. Then this goes back in the bag. If you pull a blank, then another adult token goes in the bag. Why does it matter what's in the bag? Because when you have an encounter, when you have a couple of different noise markers trying to go to the same place and an encounter happens instead, you're going to pull a token out to tell you what kind of creature is coming at you, and that's when you check for your surprise attack. So the more these get pulled and the bag gets added to with more powerful types, the more dangerous it becomes. But thankfully, once you've pulled one to bring that creature out, this particular token stays out of the bag, at least until you reach a point where some other mechanic causes you to add it, like, a breeder going in when you pull a creeper token during the bag development stage. Again, it's a very interesting way of pulling off randomness in terms of encounters, and yet still letting the tension grow as you play. Then we've got our minis for the characters. The little plastic ring there was something they added that wasn't ever actually talked about in the first place, but it works not just to help denote the characters, because they are color-coded to the character colors for their archetypes and whatnot, but they're also used, if you want to pull them off, to track clues in the co-op game if you want to not track them some other way. Now, these are sun-dropped. Okay, so sun-drop is basically this printing process that sort of hits them with paint, predominantly from the top, I guess. And the idea is they're supposed to look interesting looking down on them, not so much looking up, and not even as much looking directly on from the side, but the side is supposed to look good as well. For the heroes, they just did sort of a grayish drop here, so they look similar to what an unpainted one would look like, just with more shading. So here is our pilot. Then we have the scientist here in sort of his space-age wheelchair. There's our mechanic. Again, a stretch goal. My wife's personal favorite, the soldier. This one, for some of the early runs, had some melting going on, so they're replacing those for free if yours happens to be melted. That effect on his helmet is meant to be there. In case you're wondering, this is an African-American character in all the art, but you don't see, any of the character's face actually through the screen there. The helmet. Then we got our scout. Notice my scout's leaning a little bit. I think that's mainly because of the way that the little piece of the tray is made. So I've tended to every so often use a little heat to sort of lean her back up straight a little bit more. There's our scout. And then we have the captain. Notice there the captain's got a 6-shooter basically, sort of a space-age 6-shooter. So he doesn't use an energy weapon. His is a little bit different when it comes to the reloading and that sort of thing there. I should note, by the way, that there was another hero, the medic, that was free to all the first 24-hour backers, but it is going to be provided in Wave 2. I think I've mentioned that previously, but just in case I didn't, it is a Wave 2 thing. It's not just missing here or anything like that. I wound up not being a 24-hour or first 24-hour backer, but I picked it up as an add-on. Then we have 6 of the larvae as minis. We have 3 of the creepers. Again, think of larvae as kind of like face huggers, although they don't necessarily attach to your face, but they're what infects you. If you do wind up dying because the larvae inside you, your contamination winds up killing you, this is basically what's coming out of you, because it replaces you. Like there's a corpse of you, one of those tokens plus this that shows up in the room, but that is a creeper. Notice the sun drop effect here for the Intruders is sort of greenish. They're doing purple for the Voidseekers add-on, which was a stretch goal expansion of a different type of monster with very different mechanics. And then you've got the Carnomorphs, which is a paid add-on, which is going to wind up with a red. By the way, of Voidseekers and Carnomorphs, the Kickstarter backers got to vote on which one was a paid add-on and which one was a free stretch goal. The Intruders were always going to be in the base game. But 3 creepers. Then we have the adult Intruder. What's interesting is that there are 8 of these included, and it winds up being technically 4 different sculpts. Except, really, when it's all put together, more like they're all 8 individualized, which is really kind of cool. Aside from just the sun drop effect with the sort of blackened edges for blood and whatnot, that is cool in and of itself and makes them somewhat unique. But for instance, here's one sculpt, but they have to go in and they have to actually add the sort of stabby parts back here and the tail. So you have this as one sculpt, and then this one as the same sculpt, but if you actually look at them closely, they're not actually posed the same because their tails, and slightly with the blades, but especially the tails, are put on slightly differently. So they wound up using 4 sculpts to basically give us 8 different versions of the adults, which is really cool. I would note that the alternate sculpt for the adults, the first one, was going to be voted on by the community. The community decided, it became a stretch goal, and then they were like, you know what, we're just going to wind up using other stretch goals to give you all of them to give you more variety. So the different Intruder sculpts as alternates became available at the 650,000, 700,000, and 750,000 pound stretch goal marks. Once we remove that first layer, that first tray, there's another deeper tray underneath it. This second tray is where we're going to find our room tokens, all the different cards, all the other Intruders, and where I personally have decided to store the different tokens that go with the Untold Stories #1 comic that we looked at earlier. Again, nice plastic cover that says Nemesis. This one doesn't have a little indentation for anything, unlike the other one. And underneath, lots and lots of goodies here. So we just looked at a couple of adults. Here is another pair of adults. Again, same sculpt, but slight differences because of the changes in the positioning of like the tails and whatnot. If it's hard to tell, you got, for instance, one little tail on this side going down here by his arm, the other one on that side going up over the spike. You know, slight differences here, but still welcome little touches. Then our other adults are going to be these larger ones standing up. Again, slight differences in the position of, for instance, the tails. And all sun-dropped, all with those slight blood effects. In this case, mouths and the little talons. Then we have our other one, our other sculpt here, where they're kind of next to a piece of the ship. As our adults. So 8 adults, 4 different sculpts, with slight variations to make it seem as though you've got 8 different minis. Then these big guys are the breeders. All right, pretty creepy looking dudes here. Sort of a step between the adults and the queen, something that, if I'm remembering correctly, we don't really ever see in the Alien franchise, so it is a way that it differentiates the game. And then you've got the queen. Okay. Queen, pretty huge. Not actually to scale with the others in the story. It's actually would be much, much, much bigger than that. Because you got your creepers down here, right? So this would be much, much larger. This is your queen. Now, it wasn't included in the actual original Kickstarter campaign, but afterwards, they added some add-ons through GameFound, their pledge manager site, and one of the things they did was allow for you to be able to get an alternate version of a queen, which they were calling the king, for each of the 3 alien races. So eventually in Wave 2, we'll have an alternate version of a queen for this, which is the alien king for the intruders, and then we'll wind up with that for the other factions as well. Again, no actual gameplay difference, just an alternate version when it comes to what mini you play with while playing the game. Now that we have seen all the different minis, I do want to give you a quick size comparison here. You got your larvae, then the creeper, then the adults that are squatting, the adults that are standing, which are the same type, just different model poses, then the breeder, then the queen, and here in front of them, one of the more standard height characters, which is the soldier. So even though this kind of looks and feels a lot like the Alien films, you're going to find that the size comparison is quite different than what we'd see within the Alien films, as is the origin of these creatures and what exactly they are and how they change, which we learn in that Untold Stories co-op campaign, the comic book. Then as you play on the map, you're going to have these tiles representing rooms. There are 20 total room tiles. Originally it was going to be 19. One of the ones that was added was the airlock, which was a stretch goal at the 1,800,000 pound stretch goal. It's the one that goes with that token we saw a little bit ago. The first 11 are basic. They're labeled with 1. They will appear in every single game. You use all those room tokens in each game. We have the nest, which is a special type of room that doesn't have any items in it. It also can't malfunction, but does have an action. They're all going to have a little 2 up there to let you know that if you pay 2 different action cards, then you can do whatever it says, although this is all laid out in detail on the room sheet. This is basically just the name of the room and a little hint of what's going to happen, but there's much more detail on how to actually do it on the room sheet. But the nest is kind of a special odd one. Then you got ones like fire control system, okay? They have a color up at the top with their name, typically, and also a symbol to let you know which type of items can be in the room if you search the room. As for the number of items you could search for in the room, that's determined by that little token that I showed you earlier when you flip it up, where it's got the number on it. Whichever number matches, you turn and rotate to face a little counter on the map board, and then as you get more, like say that the marker's up here, say you have 4, then you search it, now it's 3, then you search it, now it's 2. You keep rotating it until it's down to 0, okay? And then some of them have a little computer icon to let you know that it can be remotely used by a room with another computer, but it kind of depends on what type of actions you have available. It's not a readily available thing. You have to have specific circumstances where you actually wind up using it, okay? We have our fire control system to let you initiate the fire control procedure. That, by the way, not only puts out the fire, but kills whatever's in the room. Surgery, which lets you get rid of a larva if you've got one in you, for instance. So surgery procedure. Evacuation section A lets you jump into an escape pod. There are 2 different pairs of escape pods, A and B, so this lets you get to any of the ones in A, assuming they are unlocked. Comms room lets you send a signal. That is something that's part of the objective for a lot of different options here for gameplay, different secret objectives, corporate objectives, co-op objectives, and so on. My wife and I actually played a game where we both had to send a signal as a full co-op game. We have the armory where you can recharge your energy weapon. Notice again the colors and symbols changing as we go here. Storage where you can search for an item outside the regular search procedure. The emergency room where you can treat your wounds and heal yourself, or at least make yourself a little bit better off. The generator lets you initiate and stop the self-destruct sequence under certain circumstances. The lab, right, so the laboratory, or the laboratory, that's where you can analyze an object. So that's where you analyze your egg, or a crew member corpse, or an intruder carcass to get access to those weaknesses for the intruders that I talked about earlier. Evacuation section B, then, is going to be like A, just for the other pair of escape pods. But then whereas you're always going to have all of the rooms marked as 1 in a game, you just don't know which one is which, you're only going to have a few of the ones marked 2, so you never know which ones are going to be in the game. There's your airlock control to let you start the emergency airlock procedure and blast something into space, for instance. This was the one from the stretch goal that goes with the token from earlier that I mentioned. The monitoring room where you can check another room and an exploration token to kind of see what they are, but only you get that knowledge and you can choose to lie about what you saw. Command center lets you open and close doors. The hatch control system lets you lock or unlock escape pods without having to be in the self-destruct procedure, for example. The shower room lets you take a shower, get rid of that slime if it's on you. Notice this is a white color. You can get any of the different item types by searching in here. The canteen, to have a snack, so another healing situation. The engine control room, which lets you check the status of engines without having to go directly to each individual engine. The cabins that let you catch your breath, which, yeah, notice no action icon. You can just do it by being in the cabins. That's not self-explanatory at all. It basically means that when you draw your action cards for the next turn, instead of 5, you pull 6 because you're so refreshed. And then finally, the other oddball, room covered in slime. It cannot malfunction. It has no items in it, but if you go in there, you're slimed. Now over here in the corner, I've just kept a little baggie of all the extra tokens for the comic. Let's see what those are. These are kind of unusual. Again, that comic works out kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure, but your circumstances as you end your game scenarios can change where you head after that. So we have 3 tokens here marked Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3 that tell you which ending you're going to after the scenario based on what's happened. You have 10 tokens like this one that let you know that when you go into that place and do a certain thing, a story event will trigger, which jumps you to a certain part of the comic, usually. You have 2 of these tokens to put with one of those that'll remind you, hey, this is a story-triggered event. So use the comic and figure out what things are supposed to happen before the story-triggered event happens, and once those things happen, trigger it based on where the story has gone. 2 of those. 4 that represent the fact that you put it with one of those numbered tokens, and whatever happens, happens on entry to that room for the first time. And then 4 of those same type of little tokens that when you put with one of those numbered tokens represent that on use, something happens. So you go to that room, nothing happens on entry necessarily, but as soon as you use the room action, this happens. You will come across certain story events. They're going to cause you to make choices that will have ramifications later in the game. In order to mark which ramifications you're going to get and what choices you have made, you wind up picking up these tokens, like the one marked B here, as you play. They're A through H for different story choices that happen that wind up having later repercussions. Sometimes you'll also have a special objective. There are 2 tokens for those. Sometimes you'll be dealing with Marines coming at you. That is a Marine squad, so there are 3 tokens to represent those. Kind of hard to see, but there's your Marines right there. Then you have these tokens, 14 of them representing cables for situations where there are certain instances where you have like power you have to take from one part of the ship to the other with these cables, so they get used within one of the story scenarios. Unfortunately, there's not really a place set aside for all that within the core box, since it all comes in a Kickstarter box. So I just stick them in a plastic baggie and stick them over here in one of the extra slots they've given us to allow for the extra space needed for sleeved cards. Again, as a side note, throughout that situation, you will be also gathering clues. As I mentioned, that's one of the things you can use those little colored rings for if you take them off the bottom of the character minis, but I just mark it otherwise. Now, we spoke about cards, now it's time to look at those. We have 2 different sizes, standard and sort of the smaller size that's similar to the size we got for, say, upgrades back in, say, the original version of Star Wars X-Wing or the upgrades in Star Wars Legion and so on. The first type of small card we're going to look at are the starting cards for the individual characters. Originally, there was meant to only be 2 of them, but we wound up instead with 3 for each character thanks to a stretch goal at 1,750,000 pounds. 1 per character is just sort of a base one, says starting item and then the character type, soldier in this case, and that's generally going to be their weapon, in this case marked as combat only and a heavy item, which means it has to be held in one of your hands. Most of the weapons in the game are energy weapons, so they follow certain rules about reloading energy weapons. This one starts with an ammo of 5, and each time you deal at least 1 injury, deal 1 additional injury, which is nice. Now then, each character also has 2 quest items sitting off to the side that don't actually become active until a certain situation is met, and you pay an action cost at that time. So, for instance, the auto-loader is activated in the armory room by paying 1 action, and that basically affects how the assault rifle, that is his standard weapon, winds up reloading. You then also have his armor, discard tools or duct tape, which are item cards, to activate this item and play your 1, or pay your 1. and you get armor to discard after an intruder attack to ignore that attack entirely, which is also nice. Just to run through these, without going into detail, we have our scout, who starts with a rifle. She has a quest item, which is a security key that can be activated in the cockpit. I've tried to focus here so you can read them if you want. You have the motion scanner. She discards an energy charge. Kind of like, you know, and like the whoom, 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 they're all around us, man. Yeah, that sort of thing. The scientist starts just with a pistol, but it is an energy pistol. Unfortunately, with it being a pistol, if he rolls a result that should get him 2 injuries on an intruder, it's only treated as 1. Kinda sucks, but combat's not really his thing. He has a holo computer that he can activate in the generator room. He also has the ability to discard chemicals if he gets his hands on them to activate lab equipment. This is particularly nice because basically you can examine the corpse, the carcass, or the egg without having to take him to the lab itself. Then we have the pilot, starting out with an energy shotgun. Unfortunately, it only has 2 ammo. Then we have her evacuation key she can activate in the fire control system room. And the orbital maneuvering system if she discards an energy charge. Again, in all these cases, and paying 1 action, which is basically paying 1 card from your hand. We'll see that in a moment. Our mechanic has a sawed-off shotgun, but again, only 2 ammo. It is an energy shotgun, though. A plasma torch he can activate in the storage room. That's going to allow him to actually close a destroyed door. It's the only thing that really allows you to do that. He can also discard an energy charge to get a flashlight to perform a search action. And then finally, the captain, who has that 6-shooter. Here's his 6-shooter, again, classic weapon, not an energy weapon, but basically if he rolls a 2 injury, he actually gets 3 out of it, which is really nice. But it can only be reloaded with the reload action card, not with all the other things that reload energy weapons, which makes sense. He can use the intercom if he gets rid of tools or duct tape. And then he has the log key if he goes into the comms room. And you notice any of these item cards might tell you if it's in or out of combat. We've already looked at one that was a heavy item, so it could only be held in one of the hands as opposed to just sitting in your little holder. There is an action cost with many of them. Some of them say 1 use only, so they go in the discard pile once you use it. It'll give you the title. It'll tell you what you can do with it. And typically, at least with these, since they're specific to the characters, it'll tell you which character down at the bottom. Now, I kept referring back to those intruder weaknesses, the cards that would be sitting there on your intruder board that can be discovered by going in and actually analyzing a corpse, a carcass, or the egg. These are them. There are 8 of them. Stuff like the way of moving, species on the brink of extinction, reaction to danger, the way of fighting, vulnerability to fire, vital places, susceptibility to phosphates, vulnerability to energy, and then we're back. So these, I tried to go through them quickly enough that if you want to pause it and actually see the text, you can, but it's not going to be super spoilerish if you're just looking at them very quickly because you're probably just going to catch the title. But 8 of those that could be discovered, 3 of which are used in any given game, so there's another element of randomness. We then have 8 cards that represent the coordinates for the ship. Now the ship has 4 different little slots that the coordinates could be marked for, A, B, C, or D. The question though is which one represents what. And in each game you have 1 random coordinates card sitting up by the cockpit, but you have to actually look at it to see. So you start out with it always labeled as B, but where the hell is B going? Well, on this card, B is Venus, C is Earth, A is Mars, D is deep space. But on this card, B is Earth, D is Mars, A is deep space, and Venus is C, right? So you always have those 4 possibilities, but the order of them is different, so you never quite know where it's heading, even if you know what letter is marked on the board. And if somebody happens to go to the cockpit and check the coordinates to see what it is, to compare it and see where they're going, they don't have to tell you the truth about where that is, though in a full co-op game you'd want to. One of the objectives will send you to Mars, so kind of a good thing for some. Earth is usually the destination you want to go to if you're not going to die at the end, but Venus and D-Space are basically always death. Then you have your item cards. Again, they're color-coded just like the rooms are because that's what you can search for in those rooms. The yellow type is the technical item set. You have 3 copies of energy charge, 3 copies of clothes, 4 copies of duct tape, which is nice and versatile, right? 3 different ore options. 4 copies of the fire extinguisher, which can be used to stop a fire marker by putting out a fire, or push an intruder back by causing it to retreat, which is nice. 6 copies of the also versatile tools. 7 copies of chemicals. Then 1 each of spacesuit, technical corridor plans, and Nemesis plans. Then we have the military item type, another set of 30, starting with 11 copies of its version of energy charge. Basically the same thing, but from a different item deck, because they're so valuable. Then we have 2 copies of decoy, 3 copies of recon drone, 3 copies of smoke grenade, 4 copies of just a regular grenade. Then we have several items that are 1 copy each. Comms key, evacuation key, self-destruct key, a prototype shotgun energy weapon, a prototype pistol energy weapon, a prototype rifle energy weapon, and an extended magazine that can be added to an energy weapon. And we're back to the comms key. We then have 30 green medical items, starting with 7 copies of bandages, 7 copies again of med kit, 5 copies of synthetic food, 3 copies of clothes in a different item deck this time, 3 copies of adrenaline injection, 3 copies of alcohol, and 2 copies of military drugs. We then have 12 item cards for crafted items that are technically a deck, but you don't actually use it like a deck. You just pull them out as you craft items as one of your basic actions if you have the right ingredients. One of them, with 3, in fact all 4 of the different crafted items have 3 cards each, is the classic weapon Flamethrower, which needs tools and something for flame. So for that you're going to need tools and either chemicals or alcohol. On the other hand, if you've got those tools and you combine it with an energy charge, either from the technical or military items, you can get a taser. Pair the flammable alcohol or chemicals with either bandages, clothes from the technical item deck, or clothes from the medical item deck, and you can get a Molotov cocktail. Combine your alcohol or chemicals with a med kit, and you get the antidote, which can help you keep from being infected. It still leaves you contaminated with 1 contamination card, but in theory, if you're not killed when you use the antidote, it at least will save you quite a bit of headaches later. Basically makes you less contaminated, not perfectly cured. Plus, there's always the risk that you'll die when you use it. It all has to do with how the scanning process works. Among the large cards, then, we have 27 Contamination cards. Enough for 5 players, again, thanks to the same set of stretch goals that tied into the mechanic. They have the action card back, because when you get infected with one of these, it goes face up in your discard pile for your action deck, and then the next time that you need to cycle your deck because you need to draw an action card and you don't have any, you shuffle your discard pile to make your new deck, and it winds up sitting in there so that when it then comes up when you're playing, it's just a dead card in your hand that you can't spend to do any actions. So it's got that action card back, so it's not easy to spot when it's face down within that deck. Think of it kind of like the way weaknesses work in the DC deck building game. But each of them has the same art here, and then this weird little contamination thing with this faint blue text with red over top of it. And what you do is you take that and stick that inside your scanner, which is red, and now you can read the text underneath. And there's multiple lines of text. Each one has 5 different lines of text, and as long as one of them says infected, as this one does here in that second line, you are considered infected. It's kind of a cool mechanic because even if you manage to escape the ship, if it turns out you're infected in the end and you still die because of that, if a creature winds up killing you from the inside, then you still don't win. And interestingly, if you check your contamination during the game, it could turn out you find you're infected, and that makes your situation sort of worse in terms of putting sort of a ticking clock on you for the next time you run into a situation that might wind up causing you to die based on a similar type of infection. It's a little complicated. I don't want to go into it in detail at this point because we're not talking about game rules per se, but it's a pretty cool mechanic, and the scanner is kind of a nice throwback to really kind of a 1980s type of way of seeing hidden text. Speaking of action cards, you then have 60 of them, 10 for each character. Denoted by saying action, and the symbol there of the cards on the white background, which should look familiar because you add a number to that, and that's what we keep seeing as a cost of doing room actions or using items and things like that. Now, originally, all the action cards were all going to have the same art in cases where the cards overlap from character to character. Of the 10 cards, basically 6 of them are either the same or similar across characters. Then of the other 4, there's some slight overlap, but in many cases, individualized items. But in cases where you had something like a search card, it was going to be the same art for all the cards. Then, though, thankfully, we hit the 425,000-pound stretch goal, and they commissioned all individualized art that would show that specific character carrying out whatever that action happened to be. So we start with our captain. He has a special reload card. You have a 0 here. Add 1 ammo to your 6-shooter. This is how he reloads a 6-shooter when everybody else uses energy charges for their energy weapons. Now, when you play one of these, you're going to have your deck sitting there. You're going to draw 5, typically at the beginning of a turn, and you'll be able to use those or spend those throughout your rounds of 2 actions. It's 2 actions for one player, 2 of the next, 2 of the next, circling and circling until everybody has passed. And essentially, if you have something to use, you can use reload, you discard it, and the number of cards that it shows here. Okay, so if it says a 2, you discard that card and 2 more for a total actually of 3. And only 1 card doesn't have a cost listed because that's the one that's going to be able to be played on other people's turns to interrupt things that they are doing. And bear in mind that your card hand size, remember, how many cards are in your hand determines whether a surprise attack is going to hit you, so that's kind of a big deal as well. And basically, most things are going to require you to pay those discards. That's what those 2s are on the rooms, that's what the numbers are on the items, all of those types of things. And your basic actions on your character card that had the cost of 1 or 2. When I say a cost in terms of action cards, it means discarding that many cards to carry it out. So since you only have 5 typically on a turn, then you're not going to be able to do a ton of things, but at least enough things to last a few of those 2 action rounds. So we have for the captain reload, which costs 0. Order, also costing 0. Notice there are still the symbols for whether you can use them in or out of combat. That's an out of combat only symbol. Motivation. Suppressive fire, which is similar to some that we'll see with some other characters. And then every character has some type of repair card. His is basic repairs that cost 2. Then everybody has 2 search cards. Everybody has a rest card. Everybody has interruption. That's the one that doesn't have a cost that you can do at different times. And then everybody has a demolition card, right? Which brings us back to the first one because there's only 10. They cycle pretty quickly. Our mechanic, our stretch goal guy, has interruption, of course, demolition, rest, search, another search. His is fast repair, so he can do the same thing, but it costs him 0. Ingenuity, which is unique to him. Computer skills. Technical quarters, it lets him use the technical quarters of the ship that nobody else can use. And then pyrotechnics, which sort of lets him start fires or get rid of fires as the case may be. Then we have our pilot. Again, interruption, demolition, rest, search, search. Hers are regular repairs, which costs 1, so everything from 0, 1 to 2 when it comes to costs so far with repairs. She also has computer skills, knowledge of the ship, piloting, and old friend, meaning the ship itself, the Nemesis. And we're back to interruption. Our scientist, again, rest, search, search. Notice the individualized art, demolition, interruption. His are just regular repairs also. Computer skills also. Intranet, blocking access, and risk assessment before bringing us back to rest again. The soldier just has basic repairs, so cost of 2, search, demolition, full auto, taking aim, search that everyone has, rest that everyone has, nerves of steel to get out of a surprise attack, which is very helpful. He, of course, also has an interruption. Covering fire, similar to suppressive fire, but not exactly the same. And then we're back to basic repairs again. Then we have our scout with, of course, demolition, rest, basic repairs, basic, cost of 2, interruption, search, search, suppressive fire, adrenaline, scavenging, which basically lets her search even if an item counter on a room is at 0 already, and reconnaissance, before bringing us back to demolition. We then have another deck of 20 cards that is the Intruder Attack card deck. This is another instance where they originally were going to have all the same image on all the different cards, but now each type of attack has a different illustration thanks to a 450,000-pound stretch goal. Now they're all going to have this little blood symbol up here with either a number or a symbol to retreat. The number is going to tell you essentially the health at that moment of that creature to let you know essentially whether or not the injuries that it's been hit with are enough to kill it. But it varies by situation, and the same one might draw different cards at different times with different levels of resilience. They're also going to have a symbol that denotes what type of intruder can do this attack. If you're being attacked by an intruder and you draw an intruder attack card, then if the symbol of that type of intruder isn't on the card, the attack misses. If it is, then you do whatever it says down here. So here, your creeper, right, has transformation, which turns him into a breeder, basically. Notice there, even though these are both transformation, we have 2 copies of it, the numbers at the top are different. We'll see that throughout these different types of attacks so that it's a nice deck for both attacking and checking their health at different times. All the different types, except for larvae, can do sliming. The larvae, if they attack, they just immediately put one on your character board because they've infected you, as opposed to it being something where you actually use a card. So this one works for the creepers, the adults, the breeders, and the queen here, hence the symbols. Only one of this. All the non-larvae types can also scratch you. The adults, breeders, and queen can bite you. This also is where we start getting into those retreat symbols there. There are 4, by the way, of scratch and bite. 4 copies also of claw attack, which will also be only an adult breeder queen attack. We have 2 copies of frenzy, which can only be carried out by a breeder or a queen. 2 copies of tail attack that can only be carried out by the queen. This is what killed me on our first game. And then queens and creepers can both do summoning, of which there is 1 copy. Now, I've mentioned player rounds. The player rounds happen in the so-called player phase. You basically draw up to 5 cards, you hand off the first player token to the next player, and then you do rounds of 2 actions each until everyone has passed. And once you pass even one of your actions on a single round, you can't play anymore outside of that interrupt card or interruption card. And then eventually, once everybody has passed, you move to the event phase, where you move the time tracker and the self-destruct tracker, if it's active, up by 1. Then any intruders who are in a room with the character, which is known as being in combat, pull off their attack. That's when you draw those intruder attack cards. Any intruder that's in a room with fire takes damage. The players take damage from fire at the end of any one of their rounds of 2 actions. So if they don't pass, it could happen over and over again during the player phase. At that point, we turn to our event deck of 20 cards. Event cards do 2 things for us. There are intruder symbols up at the top, and there's a number. This tells you which intruders move at that moment. This tells you which corridor they move down, and all intruders that match that symbol, who are not in combat, take that direction. Then you deal with whatever the event effect is underneath it. Among those events, you have 2 different copies of Hunt with different movement up at the top. But you have Hunt, Eclosion, which got me before, Flammable Compounds, Damaging Fire, Consuming Fire, Hatching, it's when eggs can become larvae and whatnot, after a fashion, Lurking, Bulkheads open. Scent of prey. Looks there kind of like Predator. Noise in technical corridors. Coolant leak. Notice some of these get removed from the game when they get used so they can't come up again. Nest. Short circuit. Damage. Evacuation pod ejection. Malfunction. Life support failure. Regeneration. And egg protection. So all kinds of crazy crap that can go down on the Nemesis. After the event is when you deal with adjusting the Intruder bag that I've mentioned before. Now, when you take 3 light wounds, you get a serious wound, or you could just be dealt a serious wound directly. They are limited basically to 3. Again, you get 3 serious wounds, then the next wound you get of either serious or light will kill you. You can dress a serious wound, which doesn't make it go away, but does stop an effect from it. Because you have your reverse side for serious wound here, letting us know that you've taken one. But for most of your gameplay, they'll be face up, giving you some type of detriment based on what just happened, kind of like critical damage in X-Wing. So we have 3 copies each, it's a 16 card deck, 3 copies each of bleeding, 3 copies each of arm, right, a wound to the arm, a serious wound, 3 copies of leg, 3 copies of hand, and 4 copies of body. Thankfully, these are not cumulative. You get 2 body wounds, it's not going to have you draw up to 4 action cards by dropping it from 5 to 4, and the next one doesn't drop it from 4 to 3, and the next one doesn't drop it from 3 to 2. If you get multiple body serious wounds, the effect just happens once. This actually happened to my wife during a game. Now, the goal of the regular game, which is semi-cooperative, you're trying to survive, you might have to betray the others in the process of it. The goal is basically to complete your objective, whatever your one objective is, and then get back to Earth safely, unless yours happens to be the objective that says to get to Mars safely. Ejecting, again, is going to get you back to Earth if you happen to get into an escape pod. In order to get the ship to where it's got to be, you got to have 2 engines out of 3 that are working, the destination has to be set correctly, and by the time it jumps to hyperspace, you have to be back in the hibernatorium or the G-forces will kill you. So a lot of different things have to go right. And then you have to make sure you're not infected after the fact and so on. So a lot of different win conditions. But when it comes to your actual objectives and how you get them, you are dealt objective cards during the setup process. 1 personal and 1 corporate. And then eventually when the first intruder appears for an encounter, when the first alien basically shows its ugly head, you have to decide which of those objectives you're actually going to follow. Are you going to follow your personal one and say, screw the corporation? Or say, oh, screw this, I'm going to do what's best for my job so I can be in good shape when I get back home, if I survive, and so on. Okay? There are 9 different objectives for each of those 2 types. Each of them will be marked either personal or corporate. They'll tend to have some type of flavor text, a name. It'll tell you how many players there should be for that objective to be in play. If you're going to play with less than the maximum number of players, you remove any that are from a higher number, such as, oh, this one here. If you're playing a 2-player game, the oldest friend doesn't become part of it. And in some cases, you've got either or objectives, and you simply pick one. So you're not only picking personal or corporate, you then get to pick among these while you're actually playing after the intruders are already out there. So for these we have the oldest friend, the great hunt, a proper burial, salvaging the prime asset, quarantine, hoarder, relentless investigator, best friends forever, and aliens on a spaceship. For your corporate objectives, we have an old feud, hostile takeover, the final enlightenment, ab ovo, extreme field biology, greener pastures, my precious, the right moment to strike, and necroscopy. Now, one thing that was being added to the game through stretch goals, and will still have more to come in Wave 2, was the idea of a full co-op game. That winds up being what that Untold Stories comic is that came in the special little Kickstarter goodies pack. But to start out with, they do give you the ability to play a basic full co-op game with the core set. That comes through a different set of objectives, which you can also use for a solo game. We have 7 of these. These include Cutting Off the Head, No Man Left Behind, First Contact Protocol, Emergency Postmortem, Cleanup Crew, Destination Earth, and Special Delivery. Notice no limit to number of players, but the interesting thing with these is that if you're playing a full co-op game, not only does at least one of you have to survive and make it to Earth, but all of your objectives have to be met. Not all of the either or here, but your objectives have to be met, the other player's objectives have to be met, and so on and so on. It's not just your objective and that's it. Now, you might be familiar with the Aliens deck building game, Legendary Encounters Aliens, and the fact that in that game, if you die, you could come back as an alien if you were the first player to die, and so forth. Well, this game also has a similar mechanic that'll have more depth in Wave 2 through some more stretch goals, but has at least a basic starting version here in the core set. So to do that, we get 10 Intruder player action cards. Essentially, the first character who dies plays as an Intruder now instead, has a hand of 4, drawing 3 each turn, and can use their cards to either move a chosen Intruder through a corridor that matches the number up there, can attack a player that's in combat with an Intruder by using the number of attack cards and the information given under attack cards, or can have a special effect that they use instead, which has a name and description on the card. They're all labeled as Intruder, so it's easy to spot as sort of a weird version of a player deck. Now, you might have noticed that some of those objectives cards said stuff like Player 1's character can't survive, or something along those lines. How do you know that? Well, you know that by having your help card that's given out at the beginning of the game. They're dealt out 1 to each player, and each one says your player number whatever, out of up to 5. It has a reminder to you of how the player phase and event phases work. When you pass, you flip it over to show that you have passed, and this will also assist in character choosing. Some of your objectives might make more sense for certain characters and less sense for others. But if it's a semi-cooperative game, where you want to be kind of competitive as you play to a degree, then chances are you want to have a character that matches your objective or that might be able to stymie someone else's possible objective. So there needs to be some way to fairly distribute the characters. For that, we have the character draft cards. Each one says pick whoever. There's 1 for each character. On the back it just says character draft. And in player order, based on the numbers on those help cards, you draw 2, you pick the one of those 2 you want. You shuffle them again, the next person draws 2 and keeps the one they want, and so on, until everyone has a character that they have randomly sort of chosen. Randomly picking from 2, but getting to pick which one they want out of the 2. Now, I've mentioned that one of the things they try to do if they have the extra cash and the extra production process available is to add little extra goodies now and then. And when it looked like from a card standpoint they'd have room to make about 10 more cards, they said, you know what, we're going to do that, and we're going to make them just cool little add-on cards that we didn't tell anybody about at first. So essentially they're concept art cards. They have no direct gameplay value, but there's the Nemesis on the back. And we have concept art here of the captain, the scientist, the scout, and the soldier. No mechanic, which was a stretch goal, or pilot. Then concept art of the Intruder. And then during the process of the Kickstarter, one of the things that was unlocked, the last big thing that was unlocked, was a new expansion that'll be a separate adventure that takes place after you play the regular Nemesis game, where another crew comes to the Nemesis and docks their ship with it, and goes aboard and starts discovering its mysteries, including running into some evolved creatures, running into the corpses and even maybe some of the living crew members, and so on and so on. Well, part of that process was to suggest different character archetypes to use for new characters. And once an archetype was chosen by Awaken Realms, They then provided several different concept art ideas for how that character might look, which was then voted upon by the community. And then once that was voted upon, character art was created for them and the different models for the game. Eventually, that will wind up being released as part of Wave 2 and sent out as a big stretch goal, but also someday it will probably be released at retail, but it'll have different art and different characters, different miniatures and so forth, because the characters and art are Kickstarter exclusive. Among those characters voted upon and the character art chosen, we have the Bounty Hunter, the Android, the CEO, the Convict, and the Therapist. Okay? Eventually, those 5 will come with Aftermath, and those who ordered the Medic will get the Medic, all as part of Wave 2. But we have kind of a nice little tease with those concept art cards, the last of our big cards. So there you have it, folks. Nemesis, the Wave 1 content, minus the card sleeves here, through Awaken Realms via Kickstarter. An amazing game, my absolute favorite self-contained board game so far, maybe my favorite game for tabletop gaming, including card games of all time. It is amazing and incredibly cinematic and thematic. It really grabs that feel of sci-fi space survival horror. It's like all the Alien films crammed into this, and we know that eventually we'll have another campaign, cool little add-ons as stretch goals or regular paid add-ons, and we're going to wind up having 2 more types of very different aliens to go up against to change up the gameplay quite a bit. It is fantastic. If you can get your hands on Nemesis, you absolutely should, whether it's when it comes to retail or if you manage to get in on the Kickstarter, though at this point, I think even late pledges are done, so chances are if you want all the Kickstarter stuff, you're going to be looking at eBay, which is going to cost you a pretty penny. But honestly, of all board games I've ever played, I'd say if any of them is worth spending a pretty penny on, it's this one. And probably their upcoming Tainted Grail as well. I can't wait to get in on that one through a late pledge via Kickstarter. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Nemesis Wave 1. I'll be back, of course, when Wave 2 finally arrives.